So, when I returned to Blunderstone, Peggotty had become Mrs. Barkis, and I was glad to think of her in her own house with a husband to take care of her. At home, my stepfather and his sister didn't seem pleased to see me and were clearly trying to find a way of getting rid of me. As they considered school too expensive, they finally arranged for me to start work. Although I was still only 10 years old and very small for my age, I was sent to London to work in a warehouse in the east of the city near the river. My job was to wash bottles which would then be filled with wine, or to pack the filled bottles in cases. I was paid only 6 shillings a week. There were several other boys who worked with me, but I was the only one who had been to school. All the warehouse workers were coarse, rough people who were used to working in dirty conditions for long hours. No words can describe the horror I felt when I realized what my life was going to be like from now on. I was deeply ashamed at having such a job, and I was also afraid that I would forget everything I had learned from my mother and my teachers. I would never find friends like Traddles or Steerforth, or be able to get a better position in life. It was an extremely unhappy time for me. My stepfather had asked Mr. Quinion, the manager, to find me somewhere to stay in London. So, at the end of my first day, I was called to Mr. Quinion's office and introduced to an important-looking, rather fat, middle-aged man with a head as bald as an egg. His name was Mr. Micawber, and he offered me a spare room in the house he was renting with his family. I agreed to take it, and Mr. Micawber and I walked home together. The Micawbers were obviously very poor, but tried hard not to let this show. The house had several floors of rather dirty, empty rooms with very little furniture. Mrs. Micawber was a thin, tired-looking woman with a baby in her arms. The baby was one of twins, and in all my experience of the family, I never saw Mrs. Micawber without at least one of the twins. They also had a 4-year-old son and a 3-year-old daughter. Their only servant was a young orphan girl. I never thought, Mrs. Micawber told me sadly as she showed me my room, when I lived with mother and father before I was married, that I would ever be as poor as this. But as Mr. Micawber is for the moment in difficulties, I must of course accept the situation. I'm afraid he owes a lot of money, but his creditors will just have to wait. You can't get blood out of a stone, nor can anyone get any money at all out of Mr. Micawber at present. I soon realized that neither Mr. nor Mrs. Micawber had ever been able to manage money. The little that Mr. Micawber earned was not enough either to keep his creditors happy or to pay for the needs of his growing family. So his creditors were constantly at the door demanding payment, and meals were rather irregular in the Micawber house. Mr. and Mrs. Micawber's moods varied according to the situation. One moment, Mr. Micawber looked extremely miserable and depressed. The next, he was brushing his shoes and singing a song before going out. Mrs. Micawber's character was similar to her husband's. Sometimes I came home to find her lying on the floor with her hair undone, looking wild and desperate. But an hour later, she was cheerfully eating a good supper. I lived with these kind people for several months and became very fond of them. I bought my own food out of my wages because I knew the Micawbers hardly ever had enough for themselves, and I lived mostly on bread and cheese. As they were so short of money, once or twice I offered to lend them a few shillings, which they refused to accept. But at last, Mr. Micawber's creditors became tired of waiting for their money and went to the police, who arrested him for debt. He was taken to the king's prison and asked me to visit him there. When I arrived, I was shown to his room where he was waiting for me. He seemed quite broken-hearted and even cried a little. "This is a black day for me, Copperfield. I hope my mistakes will be a warning to young people like you. Remember, if a man earns £20 a year and spends £19 and 19 shillings, the result is happiness. But if he spends £20 and 1 shilling, the result is misery. By the way, Copperfield, could you lend me a shilling for some beer? Mrs. Micawber will pay you back as soon as you arrive home." And when the beer arrived, he appeared much more cheerful. We had a pleasant evening telling stories and jokes. He stayed in prison for several weeks, and I visited him regularly. I was delighted to hear on one of my visits that he would soon be free, and his creditors had unwillingly accepted the fact that he had no way of paying his debts. I gave the news to Mrs. Micawber when I returned home. We celebrated by sharing our supper and a glass of wine together. "May I ask what you will do, madame, when Mr. Micawber is free?" I asked politely. "My family believe that Mr. Micawber should move to the country, to Devon, and carry on his business interests there. Mr. Micawber is a very clever man, Master Copperfield." "I'm sure he is," I agreed. "Although they haven't found anything exactly right for him yet, my family think he should be ready in Devon in case something turns up." She put down her empty glass. "And will you be going with him, madame?" I asked. "I must, I will." Mrs. Micawber's voice rose to a scream. "He's my life, my love, my husband, the father of my children. I will never desert Mr. Micawber. You cannot ask me to desert him." I felt very uncomfortable, as I had not asked her to desert him at all. But she soon became calm again and finished her supper. I was becoming used to the Micawbers' changes of mood. I now realized that when the Micawbers left London, as they were planning to do, I would be very lonely in the city. I still hated my work in the warehouse and wanted to make a better life for myself. I thought about it for a long time and decided there was only one thing I could do. I would try to find my one surviving relation, my father's aunt, Miss Betsy Trotwood, and ask her to help me. I knew she lived somewhere near Dover in Kent. I could go there by coach, because Peggotty had once sent me 10 shillings to keep in case I ever needed it. The time had come to use that money. To be continued in Chapter 4.